On the edge of the California coastline, rocky cliffs and crashing waves create a rough and inhospitable environment. However, resilient life flourishes under these harsh conditions. Welcome to the Rocky Intertidal Zone.
Rocky intertidal zones are the transition zones between land and sea, the region between low tide markers and high tide markers. This habitat is found at the edge of the oceans and can be cliffs, rocky beaches, rocky shelves, boulder rubble, etc. Rocky intertidal zones are places with high productivity resulting from upwelling of cold, nutrient-rich water and have a pattern of vertical zonation which creates 4 distinct layers. Roughly twice a day, at low tide, the intertidal zone is cut off from the open ocean. However, each of the individual zones differs in terms of what percentage of the time they are covered in water. The water that remains is left in isolated tide pools or under rocks, or else it has combined with the substratum to form mudflats. These shallow pools and surrounding areas, uncovered by the retreating tides, are often teeming with animals and plants, which must adapt to environmental extremes to survive.
Per their name, rocky intertidal zones are found in coastal areas where the ocean meets a rocky shoreline. They can also be found at the juncture of the ocean and an exposed face of a rocky cliff or shelf. With the exception of Antarctica, the coastlines of all continents and islands can be characterized as rocky intertidal zones. As you can see, there are rocky intertidal zones littered along the California coastline.
Rocky intertidal zones are important for a host of reasons. Firstly, they are the most populous portion of the intertidal and provide a home for countless organisms. In fact, these intertidal zones are frequently studied because of the incredible diversity of species in this habitat. Additionally, this region serves as a nursery for fish and other crustaceans as they grow and develop before venturing out in the dangerous unknown of the ocean. Also, rocky intertidal zones provide shelter in areas where seaweed breaks the waves, power, and food for fish. Finally, it serves as a feeding ground for wading birds, stabilizes inshore sediments, and the algal bed in this habitat are an important food source for rare and threatened species like sea turtles.
There are several key abiotic factors in rocky intertidal zones. Firstly, their organisms in this region are not constantly covered in water, meaning that these critters must be able to survive for 10 to 11 hours without water, depending on which layer of the rocky intertidal zone they live in. Additionally, salinity is much higher in the intertidal zone, because salt water trapped in rock pools evaporates, leaving behind salt deposits. As the ocean goes towards low tide, the water flows away but leaves high concentrations of salt, especially in the upper layers of the rocky intertidal zone. On top of this, organisms in the rocky intertidal zone face extreme temperature fluctuation. The daily temperature ranges from being very hot to near freezing in frigid climates with cold seas. Waves are another factor in this environment. During high tide, when the intertidal is covered with water, organisms must be able to bear the brunt of oncoming waves that can easily dislodge organisms not secured to their substrate. In fact, waves will carry weaker organisms that aren't fully attached out of this ecosystem. So in order to survive, species need to find a way to anchor themselves to their surroundings to prevent being swept away into the ocean. These regions are also highly productive.
Like mentioned before, the rocky intertidal zone has 4 distinct layers: the splash zone, the upper intertidal zone, the mid-intertidal zone, and the lower intertidal zone. The splash zone is the region affected by the spray from the ocean, but it is not actually submerged in the ocean, meaning that the critters in this zone are constantly exposed to sunlight. During the winter months, this zone is covered in microscopic algae because the large waves produce constant spray on the upper portions of the rocky shore. Next, the upper intertidal zone is exposed to sunlight twice per day. Herbivores in this zone graze on the populations of algae growing here and during low tide. Tide pools will also form in this zone. Slightly deeper is the mid-intertidal zone, where salinity is only marginally higher than regular ocean levels. This is the largest portion of the intertidal zone, and yet species in this zone are constantly fighting for space. Mussels are generally a dominant species in this region as they are able to avoid raging tides by attaching to rocks and other structures. Waves have a greater impact in this zone than in the splash zone and the upper intertidal zone. Finally, we have the lower intertidal zone. This zone is just exposed when there are very low tides. The aggregating anemone is a key link in the food web here, as it hosts zooxanthellae, thereby helping to buttress the algae populations of the intertidal reaches of the bay.
Conditions in the rocky intertidal zone may be rough, but the rocky intertidal zone is home to a large diversity of life. In the 4 sections, the spray zone, the high intertidal zone, the mid-intertidal zone, and the low intertidal zone, different creatures find their niche. The spray zone is home to lichen, periwinkle snails, and ribbed limpets. The high intertidal zone is inhabited by a wider variety of creatures. Purple shoreline crabs, hermit crabs, black turban snails, and anemones live among barnacles and blue-green seaweed. Mussels, urchins, snails, sea stars, anemones, sponges, black leather chitons, and more dwell in the mid-intertidal zone. The low intertidal zone is home to creatures such as gumboot chitons, kelp crabs, ochre sea stars, blue-top snails, nudibranchs, sponges, and sea urchins, and giant green anemones, as well as kelp.
There are several special adaptations for creatures in the rocky intertidal zone. Creatures living in the rocky intertidal zone need to be able to survive the constantly changing and harsh conditions. Many creatures, such as sea stars, sea urchins, and anemones, are able to stick to the ground on which they live. This prevents them from being washed away by tide changes and harsh currents. Since there is such direct sunlight, moisture can be evaporated, leaving animals dry and unhydrated. Shelled creatures, such as mussels, can tightly close their shells to keep in the moisture. Other bivalves, marine snails, and crabs have tough outer layers and shells to lock in moisture. Many creatures living in tide pools have adapted to breathe air at the surface rather than just underwater, allowing them to survive when the tide is low. Smaller organisms are able to survive in the rocky intertidal zone because they can hide in cracks and crevices in the rocks. In the rocky intertidal zone, temperatures can fluctuate drastically depending on the tide. Snails and crabs sometimes burrow under the sand to regulate temperature. Other creatures have either dark or light shells to absorb or repel light in different conditions. As these creatures are living in salty areas, they need to be able to control their salinity. Some rocky intertidal zone creatures expel salt through their glands in order to keep it out of their system. This is called osmoregulation.
The primary producers in the rocky intertidal zone are seaweed, zooplankton, and phytoplankton, such as blue-green algae, red algae, and brown algae. All of these are primary producers. They are autotrophs. They produce their own food through photosynthesis and cellular respiration, and do not rely on other organisms for energy. Primary consumers eat the primary producers. The primary consumers in the rocky intertidal zone include, but are not limited to, the flat periwinkle, the common limpet, acorn barnacles, mussels, and the common prawn. These creatures eat the primary producers and rely on the energy passed down by their food in order to do cellular respiration. Secondary consumers rely on the following consumers for energy. Secondary consumers in the rocky intertidal zone include the common dog whelk, various species of crabs, worms, shannies, sea stars, anemones, urchins, and other species. All of these species feed on primary consumers. Unlike the primary consumers, secondary consumers are not herbivores and eat the meat of other creatures. The top predator in the rocky intertidal zone is the herring gull. This gull kills and consumes more than any of the other secondary consumers. There is a strong connection between the health of intertidal zones and humans. For decades, humans have used this habitat to harvest these animals and plants for food, bait, and, less practically, for home aquariums. As human populations increase, we are becoming increasingly reliant on these regions because of the food we find here, and oftentimes end up hurting these habitats in the process. We have hunted too many organisms of different species to the point of near extinction. One of the biggest threats to intertidal zones is global climate change. As humans produce more greenhouse gases, the water level of the ocean rises, which directly affects the organisms in this habitat. However, there are solutions to these problems that each of you can do. Firstly, participation in beach cleanups and coastline cleanups can help to partially mitigate the impact of human pollution. You can also drive less, buy a more efficient car or use public transportation, bike more, and use less water. Another great action you can take is recycling, because more recycling means that less human waste is likely to end up in these intertidal habitats to begin with. Finally, we urge you to educate yourselves, because the more you know about how you are impacting these ecosystems, the more you will potentially want it to end and change it.